Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to class. Hope that you're doing well. Um, Today we're going to get into the second part of our music theory lesson. Okay. Last time we were talking about, um, you know, the different clefs and things like that. Names of the notes. I loved reading some of your mnemonic devices. Some pretty funny stuff. Okay, so thank you guys for sending that in. A little dressed up. It's Sunday as I'm recording this. I like to get a little dressed up on Sunday. I don't know. It brings a little bit of the normality back to my life here, and as we go through this thing together. Getting pretty scruffy though, growing out the beard. I told Mrs. DeJoseph I'm not going to shave the beard until we're allowed to go back outside again, so she was not too happy to hear that, but oh well. I think it looks pretty cool. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. By the way, hope if you hear the occasional scream or cry, it's you know my kids. They're being a little. They're cooped up today. It's kind of a cruddy day outside, so they're going a little stir crazy in the house today, so I apologize. They're toddlers. We can forgive the toddlers. We can forgive the toddlers. Okay. So let's see here. So these are difficult times that we're living in. These are difficult times. But what you're seeing now, are actually difficult times. We're going to talk about time signatures today. And time signatures are it's a way that we can organize rhythm in music. All right, so very rarely will you ever see time signatures that look like this. And if you're a musician in our class right now, like if you're in the band, orchestra, or chorus, I can almost guarantee you that you will never see a time signature like this, at least as long as you're in middle school. Maybe in high school, probably in college. If you continue music into college, you'll see something like this, right? So, but never at the middle school level. So, but what does this mean? 17/16 time. Actually, you know what? In middle school, you might see 9/8. You might see 9/8 in middle school, but 17/16, 13/8, you'll never see those. But what does that mean? What does it mean to be in 17/16 time? Well, we're going to go over that right now. Okay, so in time signatures, as you saw on the previous slide, you have two numbers. You have a top number and a bottom number, and those numbers mean different things. The top number means how many beats per measure. Now, what is a measure? If you might not know, if you're not in a performing group, a measure is how we organize music into sections of a certain amount of beats, right? So we have the steady beat going in music, and how many beats per measure, that's how we organize it. So it's not just a bunch of random notes on a page. You see, before we had our modern system of music notation, you would just have like a bunch of notes, and because of that, the music was very nebulous and flowy, and it was, it's hard to do it the same way twice, right? It wasn't very precise. But now with our new and new, when I say new, I mean, this is centuries old, but with the modern system of notation, it's far more precise, and we organize things into measures. So how many beats go in a measure, that's determined by the top number in the time signature. And the bottom number of the time signature equals what type of note gets one beat. And we're going to talk about the different types of notes that there are coming up. Okay, so that's what you'll see. The top number is how many beats. So if the top number is 4, then that means that there are 4 beats in a measure. And then the bottom number corresponds to the type of note that gets the beat. So the most common time signature that you'll see is 4/4 time. What that means is that there's 4 beats in a measure, and the quarter note, right? The quarter note equals 1 beat. ever see a fraction written 1/4? Okay, what's another way to say 1/4? A quarter, right? Like a quarter of a dollar, like a quarter, like the coin, a quarter is a quarter of a dollar, right? So that's why it has that name. So a quarter note, the number 4 as the bottom number corresponds to a quarter note. If the bottom number was 8, let's say if we were in 4/8 time, that would mean that there are 4 beats in a measure, but the 8th note gets the beat, okay? If the bottom number is 2, that corresponds to the half note, because the half note gets 2 beats. Now, don't get too confused if you don't understand this, because I'm going to explain it more fully here coming up. Okay, so here are some time signatures that you will often see. Now, if you notice here, there are, on each of these time signatures, there's a top number and a bottom number, right? So the top number, of course, as we just said, the top number corresponds to the amount of beats in a measure. So in our first measure here, we have it in treble and bass clef, because it doesn't really matter what clef you're in for this. The top number is 2, which would mean that there are 2 beats in a measure. And the bottom number is 4, which would mean that the quarter note gets the beat, because the number 4 corresponds to a quarter note there. Okay. And the next measure, that's 3/4. So 3 beats in a measure with the quarter note getting the beat. In the third measure, that's 4/4 time. We just talked about that. That is 4 beats in a measure, and the quarter note gets the beat. Now, this is by far the most common time signature. It's so common, in fact, that it has a nickname called common time. And sometimes, instead of being represented as 4/4, right, as 4/4 time, you'll see it represented with a kind of a script letter C, and the C is supposed to stand for common time. Okay, so if you ever see a C, that means 4/4 time. Okay, and then 6/8. Well, what does this mean? In 6/8 time, there are 6 beats in a measure, but it's not the quarter note that gets the beat. It's the 8th note that gets the beat, because the bottom number is 8. So another way you can think of that is there are 6 eighth notes in a measure of 6/8 time. Now, if the bottom number was 16, that would mean the 16th note would get the beat. If the bottom number were 2, that would mean the half note gets the beat. If the bottom number was 1, that would mean that a whole note gets the beat. So you could do all sorts of fun stuff with time signatures in that way. Okay, but let's move on and let's talk about note values. Okay, so note values. I chose this, and oh man, the reason why I chose this why I chose this slide here is being covered up by my big fat head. Oh well. These are several different types of notes, how many beats they get, what the name of the note is, what we call it here in America, and then what they call it in England, which is a little bit different actually. It's kind of funny how we, how they would call it something different in a different country, but it's but they call it something different. So we'll talk about those, right? So, but I'll just say right now, you're not responsible for knowing the British names. Okay, I want to make that clear right now. You are not responsible for knowing the British names. Okay. Now there's an owl. He's saying something here. I can't really read what the owl is saying, but I just wanted the British names on here because some of them are kind of funny. Okay, so the first one that you see on top, it's just a big open circle. That is called a whole note. It gets 4 beats. Now they say counts here, but what they mean is beats. So the whole note gets 4 beats, and in England they call it the semi-breve. Okay. The empty circle with a stem, that's the next one. That gets 2 beats. It's called a half note. and the British call it the minim. The next one, the filled in circle with the stem, that gets 1 beat. It's called the quarter note, and the British call it a crotchet. I believe that's how they say it. They don't say, I was tempted to call that the crochet, but I think it's actually pronounced crotchet. Okay, the filled in circle with the stem and 1 flag, that's worth half a beat, and that's called an eighth note. And the Brits call it a quaver. Very interesting, right? The filled in circle with the stem and 2 flags, that gets a quarter of a beat, and that's called a 16th note, and the Brits call it a semi-quaver. Okay. The filled in circle with the stem and 3 flags is worth an eighth of a beat, and the Brits call it the 32nd. Sorry, we call it the 32nd note, and the Brits call it the demi-semi-quaver. Okay, and then the last one here, the filled in circle with 4 flags, that's called the 64th note, and you can't see it because of my head, but the Brits call it the hemi-demi-semi-quaver. They really be out there calling it the hemi-demi-semi-quaver. Okay, that's my personal favorite one. I like that one. But really, the most, and we could keep adding flags, and the value of the note will, half each time we add a flag. Okay, but what we really need to know though, whole note is worth 4 beats, the half note is worth 2 beats, the quarter note is worth 1 beat, the eighth note is half a beat, the 16th note is worth a quarter of a beat, right? So, and depending on what our time signature is, that tells us how many of these can be used to fill up a measure. So, if we're in 4/4 time, let's just say, for example, the quarter note equals 1 beat, right? Okay, well, if in 1 beat, how many 16th notes can we fit? I want you to think about this for a second. I didn't know there was going to be math on this, Mr. DeJoseph. I thought this was music, not math. If a quarter note is 1 beat, how many 16th notes are 1 beat? Well, that's just simple math, right? 4 16th notes would be 1 beat, right? Because if 1 16th note is worth a quarter of a beat, then we would need 4 16th notes to equal 1 beat. So that's just for an example. So, now let's say we wanted to have a whole measure of just 16th notes. Well, how many 16th notes could we fit in one measure of 4/4 time? Well, the answer is 16, right? Right, because 4 times 4 is 16. Folks, didn't we tell you to memorize your timetables in 3rd grade? Didn't we tell you to memorize that? We knew what we were talking about. It's going to help you so much, okay? Here's another use for it. All right, so that would mean also that there are 2 eighth notes in a beat, right? So if we ever see 2 eighth notes beamed together, that would mean that equals 1 beat, although it's separated into 2 halves. Okay, so we'll see what else comes up, and we'll explain it as need be. Let's go to the next one. The dot. Sometimes in music, you'll see something and there's a dot next to it. What does that mean? Does that mean that the composer accidentally dropped his pen on the piece of paper and forgot to erase it? No. The dot means something in music. We see it quite often. A lot of people think they know what the dot does, but only few know. Few know what the dot does, but soon you'll be one of the few that know. Okay, what does the dot do? I'll just come out and tell you right here. If we were in class together, I would maybe have a more colorful way of explaining this, but I think for our purposes here, and I can see we're already like 15 minutes into the lesson, I'm just going to come out and tell you what the dot does. So what does the dot do? The dot adds half the value of the note to the note that it's placed next to. I'm going to say that again. It adds half of the value of the note to the note that it's placed next to. I got some more math for you right here. Okay, so a dotted half note. A half note with a dot next to it. How many beats is that worth? Well, I'll just come out and tell you the answer is 3. A dotted half note is worth 3 beats. Why is it worth 3 beats? Well, because a half note without the dot is worth 2 beats. And when you add the dot, what it does, it takes half the value of the note. So what's half of 2? 1. It takes half of 2 and adds it back to the note. So you do half of 2 is 1, and then 1 plus 2 is 3. Okay, so that's how you get that. A lot of people think, oh, the half note is worth 2, and when I add the dot, it makes it worth 3 beats, so the dot must equal 1 beat. That's wrong. That's wrong. If you thought that, now you know better. Okay, so the dot doesn't add a beat, it adds half the value of the note. So let's say I had a dotted quarter note. You can have dotted quarter notes. How many beats is a dotted quarter note worth? Well, what do? How many beats is a quarter note without the dot worth? It's worth 1 beat. So what do? I take half of 1. What's half of 1? 1/2. 1/2 plus 1 is 1.5. So a dotted quarter note is worth 1.5 beats. Okay? I could do this with any note. I could even say, I could even have a dotted whole note in some time signatures. Okay, let me explain. How many beats is a whole note worth? 4, right? We said whole note is worth 4 beats. What's half of 4? 2. 2 plus 4 is 6. So a dotted whole note would be worth 6 beats. But Mr. DeJoseph, how could I have 6 beats in a measure? Well, you would need to have at least 6 as your top number. So you could have a time signature where you're in 6/4 time. You could have 6/4 time. You could have 6 quarter notes in a measure. And in such a case, if you needed to fill up that entire measure with one note, you wouldn't use a whole note because you would have only 4 beats, and then you would have 2 beats left over. So what would you do? To fill up that whole measure, you would need to add a dot to that whole note, have a dotted whole note worth 6 beats. Okay? Okay. Sorry if this is confusing. Let me know if you have any questions. Okay? You could hit me up on the live stream. Okay, rests. Rests are also very important in music. Remember, if you remember back to day 1 of the class, remember when we used to go to school? Remember when we used to go into a building to have school? Well, back in those days, we talked about what is the definition of music, and the definition that we came up with was that it's the combination of sound and silence. I think it was a little bit more complex than that, but that's a basic definition of it. So it's the combination of sound and silence. So we need to have silence in music, and what are rests? Rests are silence, and they're timed, right, so that we can keep a steady beat in when we're playing music. So the names correspond to the notes that we just learned. So here, first we have a whole rest, and that is worth 4 beats. Okay, just like the whole note was worth 4 beats. So what does a whole rest mean? That means just like a whole note would be to play a note for 4 beats, the whole rest means that you're going to rest for 4 beats. Okay, you're going to be silent for 4 beats. Okay, same thing, the half rest, that's worth 2 beats. Now, if you noticed here, the whole rest and the half rest, they look very similar. So how can you tell them apart? Well, if you notice, the whole rest is a line, and then the little rectangle hangs below the line. And the half rest is the line, and then the rectangle rests on top of the line. The way I remember that is I like to think that the rectangle holds the beats inside of it. And so if it has 4 beats in it, that's too heavy to rest on the line, so it sinks below the line. And the half rest, well, it only has 2 beats in it. That's not so heavy that it will sink below the line, so it rests on top of the line. Other people just remember the half rest is the one that looks like a hat. Does kind of look like a hat, right? Okay. The symbol, the next symbol that's kind of that squiggly line is a quarter rest. That's worth 1 beat. The 8th rest has that little swoop and a dupe. That is an 8th rest. That's worth half a beat. A dupe with 2 swoops. That's a 16th rest worth a quarter of a beat. 32nd rest is an 1/8 of a beat, and that has 3 swoops. And we can keep adding swoops to get smaller and smaller increments of rest. Okay. Now, at a certain point, it becomes very hard to time, right? So this is why you hardly ever see 30-second rests, and you hardly ever see 30-second notes, really, in most music. And maybe some very advanced piano music, you'll see that. But 64th notes, I mean, again, once you get to 64th notes and 64th rests, that's also quite rare, and then you almost never get anything beyond that. Theoretically, it can go on for infinity, right? But just that's theoretical. From a practical standpoint, you hardly ever see anything past the 64th note. Okay, what are you going to do now? You're going to submit your notes, folks. You're going to submit your notes. Now, we're going to have a quiz coming up on this fairly shortly. I just want to, we're going to get through music theory here. We'll have a couple more lessons on it, and then we'll have a quiz. Make sure you're submitting your notes so that I know that you are watching these videos. And if you have any questions whatsoever, and today I'm probably going to have a lot of questions. Okay, so you could always ask your questions to me on Google Classroom or by sending me an email. Today starts our live extra helps. Okay, so our extra help is going to be on Mondays, all Mondays from 1:30 to 2. From 1:30 to 2, that's going to be our live extra helps. It's going to be on Google Meet, Google Hangout, whatever you call it. I will post the link in the Google Classroom, and if you have any questions, you could just pop on. We'll say hello. Even if you just want to say hello, you don't even have a question. If you just want to say hey, maybe you want to see if any of your friends are on too, just to have a little chat. That would be fine with me. I'll be there from 1:30 to 2 p.m. every Monday. And yeah, so if you want to ask a question related to our topics here or something else, or just to say hi, you are free to do that. I'll post the link in the Google Classroom. Until then, Godspeed.